than maybe historical grievances that people may have against other ethnic groups. So for instance, income and asset inequalities, he lists a lot of literature that argues income and asset inequality, class divides, inequalities in access to power, horizontal inequalities between different groups, relative deprivation and levels of polarization and ethnic fragmentation. These are all variables that in statistical studies have shown to be significantly associated with violent conflict, and not so much grievances per se. But that they do act, that social discontent and frustration can act as strong motivators for conflict and the participation of individuals into what he specifically calls organized violent conflict. That it breaks social cohesion. Again, there's a lot of studies that bear out that exclusion can break social cohesion, and that it can also lead to higher rent-seeking and predatory activities. We mentioned yesterday as well corruption. I think one of the messages from the Arab Spring was the fact of corruption. I think Rob also mentioned the WikiLeaks as perhaps being one of the triggers for Tunisia. And what was important about the WikiLeaks, it showed extent of corruption and enrichment by elites. And when you hear people talk about it on websites about Egypt, it's again about corruption that has taken place. So this is also an important point. And then evidence that policies that addresses inequality can actually prevent or mitigate conflict. There are also evidence in that regard. But the point that you also make is that this relationship between poverty and inequality and violent conflict is also not automatic. There are many societies with really very many poor people and lots of inequality, but they don't necessarily end up in violent conflict. That it's relatively speaking, compared to the number of poor countries and inequality, a handful of countries that experience this. Very often you would find that the most poorest and excluded people in society, somebody once said, would tend to be, old women. They tend in many countries to be marginalized and excluded, but you do not see old women storming banks or robbing banks or engaging in violent conflict. The point is that you need a lot of abilities and a lot of resources to engage in sustainable violent conflict. It's therefore very often that in this conflict it would be young males that are also well armed and they've got access to resources, to money and funding that are able to sustain this. There have been some economic studies, for instance, not referred to here by Patricia, but elsewhere. For instance, in Sri Lanka, the Tamil Tigers used to have huge amounts of money flows and money that they organized to sustain their activities. So she mentioned that it's not just collective mobilization that you gather up in a square, coordinated through Facebook, but that you need much more than that to sustain conflict and to sustain such protests. And that inequality and exclusion is unlikely to be a sufficient condition. It may be necessary, but it's not sufficient to trigger armed conflict. And that you need as well at the same time the availability of resources. And this is also often what you find in the discussion of conflict, that the natural resource curse is called the natural resource curse, because very often, especially when these resources are, as they say, very lootable, it can provide revenues for sustaining conflict where there are already inequalities and unequal access to the government. So the question then is also, how do you make the transition from violence into shared societies? And here it is really key how society manages the institutional changes that takes place during the conflict, because this creates vested interest, it creates power groups, it creates assets and so forth, which have an important role after the conflict. The reference here is specifically to social organizations and arrangements and changes in local governance institutions. This I will just quickly go through in for time. But this is really also, I think, related to civil society, to the informal sector, and to the gap in formal governance that takes place normally in conflict-ridden states. A state stops to function as a state in terms of authority, legitimacy and capability, and these authorities, legitimacy and capabilities are taken over by other institutions, which becomes what they almost call shadow states or or non-state actors in public goods. And this really builds alliances and networks and organizations and coalitions that are very important in the peace process and after the peace process. We find that there are institutions that provide public goods, enforces property rights, and provide security. And these institutions can be persistent and very efficient. Especially because in many cases they provide to the people in a local area. We have to think always about this locally is the message. They provide the ability to go around with their daily lives. People really just want security for their daily lives. And so for instance you would find that very often armed gangs who provide protection in specific areas, the population tolerate them. They actually provide to the population a sense of security. And that is very often where there are dominant conflicting groups who want to, for instance, extract payments, then that they get really conflict. But there are many areas where people will tell you that they will stay in an hotel and the hotel will pay a payment to the armed gangs in the vicinity, but these armed gangs will basically ensure that there is day-to-day stability so that people can go about with their daily lives. And very often external interference and changes in this political situation can turn this equilibrium situation into a very uncertain situation and actually then negatively affect people's lives. So this is often also why these conflict situations can persist for such a very long period of time. Because people are really worried about getting out of the situation because they are uncertain what will happen to them, what will be their prospects of continuing with their lives without, say for instance, the protection of the local militias or local gangs. So yes, it seems very complex situation and very much determined on local contexts in each country. So at the end of the slides, Patricia raises a number of questions for further research. But we have to think about how violent conflict unfolds on the wider political level, how violent groups may be transformed into non-violent political parties, how political and development interventions, for instance elections, restructuring of property rights and so forth, can actually support or hinder transformation to more shared societies. A good example, for instance, of property rights is that very often international organizations would kind of like think that individual property rights is the gold standard and that they would like countries to move to shared, to individual property rights in their transitions, also as a condition often for getting funding. But in many cases you find that women are funding their businesses through communal property rights. Right, so through the communal structures they have access to property rights and that's a benefit to them, but when the property rights now are being kind of like individualized, it is normally the males that then get preference to the property rights and the women are then excluded. So instead of really building an inclusive society, you start actually excluding people by not understanding exactly how already the institutions are dealing with some of these aspects of shared societies. So it's not a question just of aid, but it's also looking at the health, education, security, and the way in which society solve its own problems. This is the slides. This is the aspects around which Patricia's paper will resolve. I'd be happy to write down questions for her. I don't think I will be able to answer any questions.
Yeah.